confusing things. Sorry, Rafa. I know you were trying to be helpful, and I was just messing your plans up.
No problem.
Everything is fine.
Okay,
I think
cool.
we will wait just a couple more minutes for everybody to join us, and then I will start the meeting.
Of course, grand. So I'm just going to be quiet now and hand back to the organisers who know what they're doing.
Okay. Such a pleasure seeing people joining us and our students as well. I can see some students of us.
Oh,
Sorry.
good. That's
Yeah.
That's
Great.
grand.
Maybe because we should change the seats. Maybe you should sit here in the middle. It's fine. Because no, I'm looking at I'm looking at the screen and I see that this is not my place. You should be in the middle.
Jest okay, możesz tu
No,
zostać?
fine.
Okay. One more minute.
Certainly.
Can you see your students, Gosia?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There should be some music, background music.
Well, that's a good idea.
Can you hear?
Julian, what about the bells? I'm afraid you don't have the sound of bells, recorded somewhere.
Sorry about that.
We will survive. Oh, we will survive with that. Telefon Juliany?
Ja tak myślę, że jest słabe. No.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock, so I think it's the high time to launch our seminar. So welcome everyone to our next ISRS seminar organized by the ISRS, which is the International Society for Research on Solitude, an organization established a few years ago to connect people and researchers from different countries and different disciplines, but having one thing in common: the passion and fascination to explore issues related to silence, loneliness, and solitude. And ISRS is managed by our wonderful president, Professor Julian Stern from Bishop Grosseteste University. Yes, exactly. And we are happy that you are here, Julian. And together with me, Gosia Wałejko, vice president, so in charge of vice, and our great secretary, Dr. Rafał Iwański, and we are both from the University of Szczecin, Poland, where we are now, together with our great colleague and friend, Dr. Basia Rzekowska from our university. I'm sorry we don't have the bells for you today, the symbolic beginning of each seminar, from the bells from Beverly Minster, where Julian lives, and his house overlooks the Minster, and that's why we have this sound each time. But this is because, unfortunately for us, fortunately for Julian, Julian is on his vacation now, on holiday. So we are really happy that you are with us, because we are afraid that it can't be possible, but it is, and we are happy about it. I think that it's time to thank our wonderful guest, Professor Olivia Sagan from Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. Olivia, we are so grateful that you accepted our invitation for that meeting, because Olivia is the person who really does not need any introduction. She's a worldwide recognized expert in the field of psychology and psychotherapy. And now I need this piece of paper to read it properly, because Olivia is the Center Director for the Center for Applied Social Sciences, a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, an Associate of the Royal Society for Public Health, a member of the British Psychological Society and the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. And Olivia's research explores, I would say it just in brief, mental health and mental illness. I think that that's the point. And today Olivia will give an overview of the developing research on loneliness, but also the popular discourse about it, surrounding that. Olivia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. And you say you greet me here with gratitude, but the gratitude is on my part because I'm really honoured to be here, and it's so good to see so many familiar names and faces as well. So look, I have prepared a talk that will last about 1 hour. So please just jot down your questions and save them for the end, because I know what happens when us academics start answering questions. We start digressing. And I'm really presenting a paper that raises a number of questions that I'm hoping you'll kind of help me think about. So let's use the next hour to bounce around a few questions and to think about things together, because I'm not delivering a conclusion or a result. I'm delivering my observations of an area that I'm increasingly critical of and increasingly worried about, and that is the discourse and research around loneliness. So let's play with a few ideas. I'm going to be looking away from you for most of the time because I am going to be reading a paper. The paper is in draft form. It's currently in between reviews, so I can't actually publish the paper to you guys as yet. So I'll be very grateful for your comments and thoughts at the end, because it's not an unproblematic paper. It is riddled with certain philosophical quandaries, if you like. So let me start. And some of you are familiar with what I'm going to say because I've already given a similar talk, but this is a development of some of the ideas that I put forward last year. So my paper is called Loneliness, a Pandemic, ? And loneliness, you will know, is a very emotive and compelling topic. It captures something that kind of hovers just beneath the surface in contemporary and popular imagination. And it attracts an academic curiosity because it's so interested in questions about human strife and health, mental health, and social structure as well. Labelled a pandemic in 1990, the 1990s by Colleen, it was referred by The Economist in 2018 as the leprosy of the 21st century. And it was described in The Lancet as a public health problem in 2018. So you can already begin to see some of the alarmist headlines. It began to seize the headlines in both academic and popular imagination at least 20 years ago, and it's stayed there ever since. If you do a search, a quick Google search for loneliness, you will be amazed at how much stuff comes up, not just in the academic terrain, but very much in the popular terrain, policy, blogs, vlogs, you name it. In January 2023, just to give you an example of how this continues, The Atlantic reported on loneliness experienced through COVID and maintained in its aftermath. And it's now largely unquestioned as an international public health issue, with policy and interventions being developed at pace. And it's really the policy and the interventions specifically that are of most concern to me. The European Commission, for example, in 2023, this year, has started conducting an exercise mapping loneliness interventions in order to gauge their efficacy to further support policy. So these headlines and initiatives are proliferating, however, with some major oversights and often unwarranted hysteria. The Harvard Business Review reported the former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, claiming in 2017 that loneliness and weak social connections are associated with a reduction in lifespan, similar to that caused by smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity. So you can hear some of this hysteria. This kind of language and claim is fueling also, here's another one of my problems, $1 billion loneliness industry. And this has developed to provide anti-loneliness products to those who do not know what to do about their loneliness. Now, some of you will be familiar that loneliness is often conflated with isolation and sometimes even with solitude in the literature and indeed in the research, and this is also problematic. A useful working definition is that loneliness is the distress that accompanies a perceived discrepancy between desired and actual social relationships, with the word perceived being important, and I'll come back to that. Systematic reviews have now begun to separate and define these terms, and there are moves towards a clearer conceptualization. That said, loneliness is still not a phenomenon defined consistently, although we can agree it is an experience that is ubiquitous amongst humans in one form or another at some point in the lifespan. Now, this leads to some questions about the alarm it appears to be raising now in 2023 and contemporary years. So here are some questions. Are we really lonelier? Are we less able to manage feelings of loneliness? Is there something in contemporary life, however we define that, that means we are more vulnerable to loneliness? And what role is played in that mix of what Odell called the attention economy, with its frenetic overwork, and our reluctance to unplug from connected, networked, algorithmed, viewed, and voyeuristic daily existence? And for us today here, are there perhaps other ways for us to think about loneliness as a contemporary issue? So loneliness at its core is a dysphoric condition that may result, at least in part, from discrepancy thinking. And psychologists amongst us will be very familiar that that's an incongruity between your ideal and your real social relationships. The case is made for it having an evolutionary value, and that was put forward in the Evolutionary Theory of Loneliness by Cacioppo and Cacioppo in 2018. And the evolutionary case states that it is the pain of being alone that motivates us to seek the safety of companionship. And this in turn benefits the species by encouraging group cooperation and protection. A corollary consideration then is what residual evolutionary impulses remain that urge us to form groups, ideally with the optimal cognitive limit of 150 people, and that's Dunbar's number that some of you may be familiar with. And why is it that we feel a lack if we do not achieve this? So what role is there in residual needs which are tied to our evolutionary development? Loneliness has long been argued to be associated with poorer physical health, and there are numerous studies that many of you will be familiar with, correlating loneliness to specific illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure. It is also implicated with unhealthy behaviours such as smoking, alcohol consumption, and risky behaviours. One suggestion is that supportive social relationships can reduce the probability of people adopting such behaviours by minimising the impact of daily stressors or stressful events. Loneliness has also been a factor in psychological and physical conditions which are less obvious. Chronic loneliness is, for example, said to decrease physical activity, leading, therefore, in its wake, to an increased risk of fragility and frailty. It is also, according to some studies, an early predictor of death. So these are big claims. But loneliness is also widely demonstrated to have adverse effects on mental health. There's an exponential growth in its relationship with aging and aspects of growing older, such as cognitive decline, its relationship to specific conditions, for example, psychosis, and conditions such as depression appear to be particularly vulnerable to its impact. Neuroscientific research has recently identified a region of the brain believed to generate feelings of loneliness. This region is known as the dorsal raphe nucleus, or DRN, and it's best known for its link to depression. Over a lifespan, it is common for individuals to report feelings of loneliness or alienation, with research also suggesting the vulnerability of this, of young adults, the aged, and marginalized groups. For example, people with disabilities, ethnic and cultural minorities, and the LGBTQ+ population in many countries. There's an entire subsection of loneliness study devoted to just exploring the stigma of loneliness and what has become the taboo of loneliness. And this is driven in no small part, perhaps, by the ubiquitous optics of connection, friendship, company, and group activity across social and other media, alongside, on the other side of the imagery, the loser imagery of loneliness. During the COVID-19 period, the study of loneliness increased exponentially, with new states such as sudden onset loneliness being described. The pandemic was perhaps the greatest test to us yet of our species, to our vulnerability to loneliness, social isolation, and imposed distancing from others. Sudden onset isolation and loneliness, as experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, has had noted impacts on both physical and mental well-being, and the relationship between worry, anxiety, and loneliness during COVID has also been documented. That said, there is also the emergence of testimony about the unexpected benefits of having more aloneness, including an increased connection with nature and an increase in some types of creativity, which is particularly of interest to me because my research borders creativity, loneliness, and mental well-being. And research is still coming out of that period regarding the affordances and positive outcomes of lockdown, although it remains challenging in these studies to extrapolate what could be hypothesized as relating to factors during the pandemic other than loneliness. So there's a number of issues with some of the COVID studies. So look, it would seem then from a first reading that the evidence of loneliness being detrimental to health, correlated with the ill health, and more harmful to and prevalent amongst vulnerable members of society is pretty irrefutable. However, the very claimed prevalence, pervasiveness, and supposedly universality of loneliness, as well as its supposed dramatic rise, should give us a reason to pause a little bit, to consider and to inquire. And today's paper is really part of that pausing and questioning and inquiring what's going on here. I want to talk about some of the limitations of the research into loneliness. The recognition of its limitations is growing. Carnick, for example, finds the experience of loneliness simply not adequately addressed in the existent literature in healthcare fields, pointing to the tendency to regard loneliness as a social deficit problem discussed in reductionist ways and frequently reproducing unwarranted stereotypes. As noted by Victor, despite its complexity, and I quote, empirically, loneliness is presented as an unproblematic concept that is universally understood and experienced homogeneously. The metrics of loneliness are also being questioned, with researchers calling for the field to rethink them and to begin to, quote, account for the diverse and intra-individual experiences and trajectories of loneliness. It is also a concern that definitions and measures of loneliness may inhibit the revelation of the cultural context and heterogeneity, with reservations being cast, not before time I might add, regarding cultural and linguistic clumsiness, as it becomes clearer that the meaning of the very word loneliness may be conceptually different in various cultural contexts and different languages. But there are other concerns too with the research. The idea of social contagion, for example, suggests that individuals adopt the attitudes or behaviours of others in the social networks with whom they communicate, and a 3 degrees of influence role of social network contagion has been demonstrated for other emotions such as happiness. Fowler and Christakis have done some interesting work in the area. The 3 degrees of influence rule basically goes, I have a set of languages and behaviours, and therefore I share that with my friend, they share it with their friends, and so on. So this idea of social contagion has become of real concern to me. Applied to loneliness, the indication is that when a person engages in behaviours and emotions related to their loneliness, the signals they send can spread via this process to those around the potentially lonely individual, who then is more likely to mirror emotions and behaviours, which in turn can engender loneliness. Whilst this factor has been explored by some researchers with regards to loneliness, Cacioppo being one of them, it does remain under-addressed. As a serious confounding phenomenon in loneliness study, when we make claims about who is or who is not lonely. Related to the social contagion conundrum is the role of the self-fulfilling prophecy, with some studies already suggesting that stereotypes of age stage in particular and expectations of loneliness play a role in determining future loneliness, for example, amongst the older population, a target population of so many loneliness interventions. And I know this from my own work with aging populations. There is an expectation in given cultures that they will experience loneliness now. The social contagion factor, along with our vulnerability to expectations about ourselves formed by cultural messaging, both have a role to play in descriptions of how identity and self are formed. If, as Yuval Harari insists in 2015, we are essentially a narrative species with our beliefs, expectations, and by extension, our behaviours, thoughts, and emotions being based on and formed through the stories we believe, subscribe to, and reproduce, be these about religion, political movements, or indeed loneliness epidemics, then the possibility of the contagion of loneliness gains further hold. The power of narrative and how the stories we hold on to about who we are and how we are do become inscripted into us, courtesy of our brain's plasticity. And this is now of great interest to neuroscience, with Burns in his book from 2022 really looking into how narrative forms our identity, which is then fed back into narrative. We should be asking ourselves whether we are, as a person, as a community, or even a species, thinking of ourselves as lonely and therefore thinking ourselves into loneliness. There is another concern, however, and that's the individualization and medicalization of loneliness. This regards how that experience is framed as we multiply it, how it takes its very shape as a regime of truth, echoing back to Foucault. The ways in which loneliness is framed in popular and academic discourse invariably both individualize it and medicalize it, often positioning loneliness as something shameful and potentially pathological, framing it as a public health issue rather than a socioeconomic problem. Lee Hunt and colleagues also note in 2017 that while literature linking loneliness and isolation to increasing health inequalities is growing, there are far fewer studies that have investigated the risk factors due to socioeconomics. Loneliness is rarely exposed as an issue exacerbated or even caused by particular policies in housing, welfare and education. For example, policies that effectively isolate, separate, discriminate and stigmatise people. Perceived overcrowding in city and urban settings, for example, has been shown to drive feelings of disconnectedness. So has an absence of connection with a natural environment. So while loneliness is framed as a health problem, we omit to frame it squarely as an outcome of a structure which is imposed in some ways by a culture. Denied community, denied family, and social structures such as libraries, green spaces, community centres, swimming pools, populations are then targeted by policy, by interventions against loneliness. By medicalising what should be positioned as a social problem and associating it de facto with health problems located in the individual, it could be argued that this in itself is detrimental to people's well-being through potential iatrogenic effects. By locating loneliness in the individual, neoliberal discourse urges self-management through prescribed behaviours, a discourse that, while appearing to empower, actually employs a moralistic undertone to craft the person as both expert and manager of their care. This process of responsibilising citizens, widely critiqued by campaigners and academics opposed to the commodification of mental health, also succeeds at the same time in irresponsibilising governments and institutions. It is well worth noting that within a neoliberal context, although our well-being is inextricably linked to the lives of others, we are bombarded with messages both overtly and covertly that our prosperity is based on competitive self-interest, individualism and individual consumption. There is little room for, or indeed tolerance of, the loner or the introvert. According to a new book by Sheila Liming, in this fast-paced, atomised milieu in which shared public space is diminishing, we are simply losing the skills of hanging out with social impacts downstream. So Liming argues quite forcefully that we are losing the skills of connecting with other people. Our current network team working climate, in which ironically we are no longer able to hang out and talk to strangers, both pathologises some personality types and ostracises or medicalises a proportion of our community, disparaging them as loners. I want to move on now to look at alternative perspectives of loneliness and, importantly, to a restoration of agency, because what much of the discourse that I have discussed so far does is remove agency from the person. And both philosophy and literature have long traditions, stretching back to at least ancient Greece, of viewing loneliness in much more complex and beautifully nuanced ways, and ways that are provocative in terms of how we understand the self. These accounts are less based on reductionist ratios of numbers of networks and friends, and much more on a qualitative, textured understanding, an inquiry into what meaningful life consists of with regards to another or others. I can't do justice to this canon here, but readers are pointed, of course, to Ben Lazar Mijskovic. I never managed to say his name properly, I apologise, whose assertion that we are all a priori necessarily, quote, universally and innately lonely is explored in detail in his work. So let's have a quick look at some of the 20th century philosophers, because they must be given a mention here for their preoccupation with the development of the subject of loneliness. Some of you will, of course, be familiar with Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, who both viewed loneliness as an ontological necessity arising at the moment of confrontation with our mortality, throwing down the gauntlet of the experience as one that all human beings face, a very human challenge to which we need to muster the strength to confront, yet we must also find a way to make creative use of, and there sneaks in the agency. Phenomenologists, including Sartre as existentialist, who famously stated that hell is other people, nevertheless contributed rich provocations to conceptions of loneliness, claiming at its core an iterative being with others dynamic. In this dynamic, an understanding of oneself can only be arrived at through an understanding of how one is in relation to others and the world. Simultaneously, when one seeks to understand others, one must also understand them in relation to oneself. And through this lens, which I particularly love because it has echoes of Buddhist Dharma, we can better grasp the philosophical views on loneliness of later philosophers and phenomenologists, Mustakas, Fromm, Storr, Rufus, whose work we cannot begin to enter into here today, but whose work nudge at the possibility that being a loner opens access to imagination, to concentration, to inner discipline, as well as invention and originality. So much of this exploration, as it moves through philosophy, phenomenological and existential arenas, to psychoanalysis and humanistic psychology, reflects the formation of the self as both intrapersonal and interpersonal, and it posits a concept of loneliness as grounded in the human capacity for love. The literature, in fact, in which loneliness is viewed through a much more hopeful and creative lens is vast, but it's overlooked and marginalized in popular discourse and research. Psychoanalytic theory also has long contributed to exploring loneliness. Much of the canon is understandably less interested in causal or correlational relationships with ill health, but it does fully recognize the existential pain and psychological distress of its experience. A seminal paper by Fromm Reichmann from '59 first drew our attention to the kind of existential terror that we have of loneliness and how far we actually go to avoid it. Object relations theory points to the formation of functional holding introjects as a prerequisite for managing loneliness, usefully suggesting that when a real object isn't present, one must learn to do with an internal felt presence. This capacity is absent for some people, most notably, according to, amongst others, Adler and Buey, individuals diagnosed with a much contested diagnosis of personality disorder, in which an extreme intolerance of aloneness is a core feature. In 1991, Peter Fonagy, who some of you will know, a fantastic Hungarian psychotherapist and also a previous boss of mine, so I have to give him a nod. He extended our understanding of this drawing on deficits in mentalization to understand an intolerance of aloneness. And there are some really elegant examples of how both these formulations have been taken forward in the research arena. Fonagy's later work on psychotherapeutic mentalization practice and research from 2022 foregrounded the important role in combating loneliness of epistemic trust, and demonstrated how, with improved mentalizing, individuals become more sensitive and more accurate in identifying their personal narrative, alterations in which could be of significant benefit to their mental well-being. These are rich formulations and rich conceptual means by which we could and should be exploring the lived experience of loneliness and the ways in which early years experiences, epistemic injustice, and compounded socioeconomic and political factors all work together to weave a complex web of vulnerability to aloneness and an inability to confront and manage it. But psychoanalytic thinkers have also stressed the importance of the experience, and researchers have begun to ask why it is almost overlooked in our contemporary formulations of loneliness is the exploration of the possible benefits. For Winnicott, famously and importantly, the capacity to be alone from his 1958 work is nothing less than a key to creative living. And we can ask questions here today about how it is that we are nurturing that capacity or not in our current educational system, with which I know some of you are very preoccupied. in our educational system at all levels. It appears to be entrenched in an unquestioned commitment to teamwork, group work, interaction, hyperactivity, while denying any kind of intrapersonal quiet space for people to think and grow alone. Melanie Klein's poignant theories on the roots of loneliness also suggest a creative rather than a destructive side of loneliness, again recognizing the inherent propensity of the human being to feeling profoundly alone, but also addressing how that human being, ever resourceful, ever creative, ever able to restore, can, given the bare essentials of life, face, address, and marshal the experience of loneliness in the service of profound growth. These examples of alternative and rich readings of loneliness leave us room to do a number of things. Firstly, to view loneliness as part of the messy, painful, joyful human condition, and an experience which, yes, may indeed be giving us signals from deep in our evolutionary hardwiring that we need to get out more and smile more at our neighbours and make eye contact with our colleagues. But not only. The sense of loneliness that we experience may also point to the need for a life more examined, a change perhaps, and a more frank but compassionate internal dialogue. Hand in hand with this relationship with the self, these alternative views also point to the creativity accessible only perhaps through introspection and solitude. Finally and crucially, such views restore some agency and potential to the person, allowing us to be less a victim of this so-called loneliness pandemic and more a human being grappling with the human problem of being. So it is remiss of us, amidst our global panic about a loneliness pandemic, to omit to ask deeper questions about how loneliness is imbued with loss, with gain, with home and belonging, with sorrow, exuberance, and the excitement of wondering who we are or could become in our challenging liquid modernity. The experience of loneliness is in sum complex, with large gaps remaining, and I quote Yangunas, in our understanding of loneliness, gaps remaining in the rates and drivers of loneliness in different populations and its effect on health and well-being. As an experience, it alters and shifts at different stages of life. It's rarely experienced in the same way by an adolescent or an older person, or even by the same person at different points in their life stage. It is subject to the vagaries of culture, of history, of place. It therefore has a strong temporal and spatial element, rarely explored due to a shortage of in-depth longitudinal data. But there are other concerns with the discourse of loneliness that I'm going to turn to now. The first one is the politics of loneliness. The word loneliness comes from oneliness, which is quite interesting for those of you who are linguistically excited. It only picked up currency after 1800 as industrial society and then consumer capitalism began its process of fragmenting and isolating us. We began to live alone for the first time. We began to age alone for the first time, and we began to die alone. But current headline statements about loneliness mask a view of being alone as one of the costs of us having more choice. So here's a kind of double-edged sword way of viewing loneliness. The experience of liberal democracy, as Dunn in 2010 put it, holds an inherent paradox because loneliness, and I quote, is both a fulfillment and a disruption of its possibility. The rise of privacy is itself a product of market capitalism, and it's also a driver of loneliness. The pandemic threw into stark relief a drift already underway, and that drift was one of the affluent urbanites to rural areas who all cited a desire for space and privacy. The preponderance of dormitory towns, gated communities, high security cocooned executive dwellings, and the general gentrification of our inner city areas All point to a felt need for privacy and a chosen dislocation, and to the choice of the privileged to sequester and insulate. We have more choice than ever about where we live and with whom we live, but also more choice, thankfully, about whether to remain in unhealthy relationships or not, and whether to live in overcrowded settings or not, or whether to uproot and move in search of a better life. The trend of single-person households appears to be extending across all world regions. Whilst far from evenly distributed, there is also more choice over our employment patterns, and the rise of digital nomadity is a fast increasing employment choice, albeit with loneliness as a challenge that has already been demonstrated amongst that population. There is also a welcome general shift to remote working, despite its isolating impacts, and the so-called gig economy, with its precarity but much vaunted flexibility, has been shown to foster uber alienation and loneliness. Driven by market forces and a plethora of tiny shifts, influences and risks in daily life, we make choices as a society about what we value, and we design for atomization and isolation. Just observe the rise of headphone and earbud wearing, noted in an Ezra Klein podcast recently, and how difficult it is now to approach someone wearing earphones the whole time just to say hello and just to start a conversation. So some of our choices in post-developed societies are double-edged swords. And while our move away from real communities to online communities, real spaces to online platforms, real reality to virtual reality, these may lead to the formation of friendships. Social media users also have described the experiences of weakening friendships, online ostracism, and heightened online loneliness. Many of the gains of eroded tradition that we made in the 20th century, perhaps most notably for women, did come at a price, and a heightened sense of loneliness, fleeting or chronic, may be a price we are willing to pay. Critical evaluations of the family, which describe it as a stultifying and oppressive institution, were to be welcomed as enabling more egalitarian alternatives to the family to develop. Choice always comes at a cost, and this dilemma, faced by many who are extricating themselves from oppressive family, cultural, or religious structures, is not helped by our alarmist discourse of loneliness. While much loneliness research understandably focuses on the individual and/or particular target groups, wider forces in society need to be front and centre of the loneliness debate. Neoliberalism's promotion of competition is widely claimed to be undermining a sense of solidarity, and a 2021 study argues that neoliberalism appears to be harmful to health because it can create a sense of being disconnected from others, as well as being in competition with them in ways that feed feelings of loneliness and social isolation. And that's from Becker and colleagues in 2021. Part of a pattern of hyperconsumption and increase in materialism has also been associated with loneliness. In a 2013 study, materialism was associated with an increase in loneliness over time, and loneliness was associated with an increase in materialism over time. Tragically, in this logic, we buy stuff that temporarily gives us a fix and distracts us from our emotional world, but this soon makes us feel even lonelier. So we then go and buy more stuff. The loneliness debate should encompass, therefore, such powerful structural drivers of the way we feel. Becker and colleagues in 21 urge that as we tackle loneliness, we need to be mindful of the fact that its causes can be political as much as social and psychological. But one of the most ominous aspects of the rising rates of loneliness is, according to writers such as Damon Linker in 21, that therein lies a partial explanation for increased political polarization, with growing numbers of people attracted to more radical forms of political dissent on both the right and the left. Linker also suggests that if loneliness and isolation become worse, so could our political pathologies. In 2021, a New York Times article by Goldberg observed that one likely reason for the expansion of the extremism of QAnon in the US. Sorry, I have to bear with me while my paper disappears and comes back. So one of the reasons for the expansion of QAnon lies in the COVID lockdowns, during which time people had their social lives obliterated and stuck at home alone. They had more time to get sucked into internet rabbit holes. These warnings make the 2016 murder of the MP Jo Cox in the UK even more tragic, but potentially more politically galvanizing. Jo Cox died after being shot and stabbed multiple times by a supporter of white supremacism and exclusive nationalism. This kind of new populist, polarized non-thinking was precisely what political philosopher Hannah Arendt warned of as a consequence of citizens becoming isolated and vulnerable to political pathologies in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism from 1973. Her work is now enjoying a renewed readership as populist movements continue to gain traction across Western liberal democracies, and political scientists and commentators draw parallels between the political crises of the previous century and those through which we are living today. So Arendt, with her perspectives on loneliness, she first gave us a crucial link to understanding the danger of loneliness as part of control. And it was she who placed loneliness firmly in the political sphere. Her positing of the implications of loss of world is relevant too, by which she points to the profound alienation experienced through losing a protective place of one's own from which one can be shielded from, quote, a naked exposure to the exigencies of life. Her deep take on loneliness suggests that we have entered a state of organized loneliness encouraged by government in order to increase the docility of citizens through the impoverishment of the world held in common. In cutting us off from human connection and a shared sense of the world together, we, the lonely, are impotent, unable to realize our full capacity for action. Loneliness, in Arendt's argument, also means that people lose contact with their thinking selves, and terror and panic replaces solitary thought. In this final stage of the paper, I'm going to turn to a recent development of Arendt's work by Sarah Lucas in 2017, in which she introduces the concept of ontological agency with regards to Arendt's work. And I'll explain later how I'm drawing a full circle between health research and political science. Agency, a buzzword of the social sciences for the past 2 decades, has multiple definitions and interpretations, and I'm not going to go into those definitions here today, you'll be glad to know, other than to suggest that the term agency is a useful placeholder to refer to the capacity and freedom of individuals to make choices and act on these in ways that make a difference in their lives. It is a hotly contested concept, partly because it immediately draws into discussion questions about equality, access, rights and responsibility, not to mention personality type and free will. At core, 2 questions always remain very alive. Who has agency and how do you get it? For Arendt, one means is by acting together. When people act in concert and create a common world, they develop a common language and understanding. This enables them to make claims about their human and political rights. We gain agency through the power of recognition, through seeing and being seen. And this is important because this is where health research comes in and phenomenological research comes in. We gain that agency when we feel we are seen and we really see others. For Lucas in 2017, reading Arendt, appearance in the world is a kind of agency, and loneliness then is the failure to appear as a self in the world. If we step back from the ontological challenges posed by Arendt and so elegantly extended by Lucas, it is clear why observations of the multiple malaises of neoliberal democracies, including a lack of trust, disaffection with political processes, binary populist positions, individualism and alienation amongst apolitical, atomized masses, can nudge us to see loneliness as an outcome of, at least in part, a vacuum in the sense of agency. This is a lack partly attributable to not feeling seen, to experiencing, in an Arendtian sense, a loss of the world. For Lucas, the capacity to appear as a unique self in the world is intersubjectively constructed in and through relationships with others. In her analysis, to which I have far from done credit to, Lucas adds, and I quote, "Loneliness is cumulative. It seems to breed more loneliness. Once the world is lost, it's very difficult to get it back." If we risk simplifying this and boldly state, for the purposes of today's talk, the experience of being seen and recognized as part of a shared something ushers in a sense of collectivity and agency, then we have some means by which to understand our rates of apparent increased loneliness in post-developed societies. We also will have forged an important link between work in the medical humanities, for example, Peter Fonagy's work, which points to the importance of epistemic trust, by which an individual or group of individuals can trust social sources of new knowledge in counteracting loneliness. If you think of the phenomenon of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, for example, and the loss of trust we're all experiencing in information, we can see how this is really feeding some of that disaffection and lack of epistemic trust. We can also better grasp the conundrum of loneliness, not necessarily being related to increased numbers of friends and not related to how many friends and networks you have, but it is intrinsically related to the power of qualitative relationships over quantitative. Let me begin to end. From political analysis to the medical humanities, where I sit. As a researcher in the area of loneliness, my research has been far from immune to the tricks and traps of pervasive thinking about loneliness. My work is seriously flawed. I'll be the first one to tell you that. Research funding I have obtained has been gained at least in part due to the topical nature of my inquiry and the benign interest that we all have in helping lonely people. I have written about the experience of loneliness brought to me by clients when I was counselling, loneliness amongst students, and a big project that's still ongoing, the experience of loneliness amongst people with enduring mental illness from 2017. I've also written, my first work was actually in 2008, which explored the loneliness in learning. I've written about loneliness and the experience of borderline personality, and loneliness in the art-making process, which is, again, an ongoing pursuit of mine. I found some interesting developments in the ways in which loneliness was experienced and managed over time, and a raft of strategies to help deal with loneliness, alternative framings, and the cessation of feelings of loneliness sometimes in cases where no other factor had been introduced, let's say a new group of friends. I also observed the role of aging in some of my studies, the role of self-narration, how people can narrate themselves into loneliness and also narrate themselves out of loneliness. I observed the role of good talking therapy. I observed the role of the outdoors and the natural environment in combating isolation and the awe of nature. Many of my findings resonate with the work on loneliness of psychoanalytical and humanistic psychologists. Some of it resonates with positive psychology, which, despite its many critics, of which I am one, does make a strong case for us highlighting human strengths rather than weakness. This phenomenological narrative work has been charged with a sensitivity based on my professional and personal experience and on my readings of people like Javi Carrel and Arthur Frank, who have been North Stars for me in guiding how healthcare professionals and researchers should respond to the human experience of pain, of illness, and of loneliness. And there are two common factors in all of my hours of narrative across these studies. And I just want to remind you that my research commonly asks people to tell me their life story. So I engage in long narrative exchanges with these people. Here are the two common factors. Firstly, as human beings, we need to be seen and therefore in some way validated. This has emerged most recently amongst a study with refugee and migrant communities, where the experience of multiple rupture and disintegration of anchor points of life was contributing to renewed loneliness. That's a forthcoming paper later on this year. Rupture, accompanied by social or interpersonal absence, as described by Roberts and Kruger, can be a potent mix for deep loneliness. Secondly, the other common theme I found was that loneliness is compounded. As with any experience of emotional distress, repetition can calcify it. It ingrains itself into our self-narrative and thereafter constructs our very sense and image of who we are. Such compounding of loneliness occurs through repeated deficiencies of response, beginning with childhood experiences of not being seen or adequately responded to. Seminal studies, which some of you will be familiar with by people like Colin Trevarthen from 1979, are now being further supported by neuroscientific discovery, for example, Nagy in 2010, which testifies to the vital role of reciprocity in interpersonal interaction in very early years experiences. Further compounding occurs through trauma, injustice, ostracism. Being overlooked and being underseen may continue through the deep cuts of epistemic injustice, poverty, and the dearth of opportunity, all experiences which erode trust and disintegrate agency, which brings us right back to Arendt and to Lucas and the argument that the absence of agency is the condition of loneliness. So let me conclude. Research in the medical humanities has been vital in keeping the importance of context in understanding the health of the individual high on the agenda of health practitioners and academics. Many of these professionals across the medical sphere will be confronting the symptoms of the silent epidemic of loneliness and its corollaries in our day-to-day work. And a plea is made here for us to maintain a phenomenological and political sensibility in working with these. So there's a real practical application to these theories of loneliness. There is a plea too for us to apply a hermeneutics of suspicion, thank you Ricoeur in 1970, to the headlines and research, as well as epistemological humility to what we think we know about the problem of loneliness. Because when it comes to loneliness, there are personal legacies and perceptions, psychological nuance, there is socio-political context and deep structural epistemic injustices. There are real threats to both health and social structure as a result of the erosion of social connection in society, which may double back and further fragment our communities. And then there may be the question of how many friends we have who are able to truly see us and have us see them truly. And there I finish for today. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Olivia, for this lovely speech. So rich, so inspiring, and full of so many interesting thoughts. And I believe that each listener will be steered by a different part of that, by a different content. I think about myself that what especially appealed to me when I was listening to you, was the first thing is that you are absolutely right that we should be more concerned, that we should care to be more inquisitive and humble when we face this problem, because probably we move only on the surface of that, repeating the superficial stereotypes and so on.
Yeah.
We should go deeper.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this elephant in the living room when you were saying about this global climate. I mean, this political, structural climate fostering loneliness, and saying that being intrapersonal is a shame, that being interpersonal is right. So these are my first impressions. Of course, there are a lot more of them. Now my role is to open the discussion and invite our participants, our guests, to ask questions and share your comments, please.
Thank you. So I can see hands up, but I'm hoping that you will guide me, because I don't want to miss anyone out.
Yeah, I think that Professor David Weir is raising his hand. David, please ask your question as first.
Hello, I'm David Weir. I work at York St John University. I'm a sociologist, Monkey, but I've worked in business education since 1970. I would like to frame the question by asking you why, when you quoted so ably from such a wide range of literature that you're clearly the master, the mistress of, why you omitted Jung from your list of patron saints, where Jung has many important things to say about loneliness and solitude, and I think incredibly well notices the essential bipolarity of what we're talking about. So that's a to it. Then I question, in a sense, the omission of Marx, if your analysis with which I fundamentally agree about the neoliberal society and its many malfeasances and bad consequences, why you omit Marxian perspective. And thinking on that, at one time Lenin said, when the intellectuals have failed, that is the time for the proletariat to become Bolsheviki and take the lead. So how would this happen? So that's where my question comes. And I'm thinking of three trends which are very widely noticeable in popular culture. One is hard rock, which has been a meme in of rejection of neoliberalism, is owned by the hard working class and the people who support Donald Trump. And if you look, for example, at Led Zeppelin, one of the most played YouTube tracks is their Rock and Roll, in which again you get a recognition of loneliness. The word that appears most often in the lyrics of Rock and Roll is lonely. It's been a long, lonely time. So in hard rock, you have this recognition that loneliness is something that has this bipolarity. Likewise, you have it in country music. Hank Williams, I'm so lonely, I could cry. Now, I suggest there's a link here, which is that loneliness is something that can be celebrated collectively. So it works positively as well as negatively. And the third thing, I'm business education, which is a really bad place in many ways and responsible for many bad things in higher education and tertiary education. And I've been part of all that. But one of the things that it has brought back into the realm of skill sets that academics are supposed to have. It's how to deal with reflexivity and individual reflection on the sense of agency. So I don't think it's neoliberalism can be countered, but the system is creating already availabilities, potentials for countering it. Would you go along with that? Sorry, it's a long question.
No, thank you so much, David. Thank you for those provocations, not just questions, but provocations, which I always enjoy. I must admit, I didn't catch all of what you said because the sound is cutting out a bit, but I'm going to address the points that I think I heard.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm really tempted to ask you to sing the Zeppelin song because I'm not familiar with it. Oh, you dear. Thank you very much for that. And you mentioned a really interesting point. I'm just going to deal with the music element because music, as you will know by bringing in Zeppelin, music and country music as well, replete with references to loneliness. When I worked on the book that Julian contributed to, I wanted to use song lyrics for every chapter, and I found there were so many. So yes, thank you for the Zeppelin one. Thank you for singing that as well. Working backwards, the question of business education and reflexivity, that's really interesting. I mean, there are educators in the room who will know better than I do about the role of reflexivity and critical thinking in some of the subjects at higher education. So I don't have an answer to that, other than to say it's not only business that suffers from perhaps a malaise of problematically teaching reflexivity and encouraging reflexivity. So I'm going to rest that one there. I think there is something about all our curricula in higher education that works against kind of reflexivity and critical reflexivity, as I prefer to call it.
Yeah.
If I come to your points about marks, in the full paper I do mention marks. I don't go into marks in great detail because marks, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong here, David, but Marx talks much more about alienation than actual loneliness. And the more I looked into the Marxist work, the more I thought, you know what, we're actually not talking about the same thing here. And it's very easy for me in particular to go down rabbit holes of alienation of worker and labour and profit and loss and that sort of thing. So although I do mention Marx as indeed a political theorist who has something to say about loneliness, I specifically don't go into Marx in detail because I worry about kind of smudging of terms there between Marx and alienation and loneliness. The omission of Jung is really interesting because you'll know that there's quite a schism between object relations on one hand, coming down from the whole kind of Freudian disaffection with Jung and the fisticuffs that Freud and Jung kind of enjoyed. So it is an omission, but I have made a note to go back to Jung on your recommendation because it's been many, many years since I read Jung, because I followed a different psychotherapeutic direction, like I say, object relations. But I will go back on your recommendation because I've got a sneaking suspicion that may be an omission that I need to address. Can I go back to you, David, and see if there's anything that I didn't address, perhaps through not hearing you properly?
No, I addressed it very much. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, lovely. Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Does anyone else like to ask a question, please? Do not hesitate to do it.
Otherwise, I have questions for the audience.
Yes, of course, Olivia. Of course.
Well, while we are waiting for questions to come in, I would really love to hear from anybody who is encountering loneliness either in their clients or their students or in themselves or in their friendship groups. You know, tell me, what am I missing? Is there something of the experience that I'm missing? Are there groups that you think we should be looking at? I'd really like to hear anything from the audience, but I know it's hard for us to speak out in this format.
Julian is raising his hand. Please, Professor Julian Stern.
Thank you, gosh. I don't know if you can hear me. The boat is floating away. Wi-Fi may be lost. I was fascinated that you mentioned that some policy interventions actually increase the sense of guilt in being lonely, or shame of being lonely. For me, in my research, I found a whole dimension of the emotion of loneliness which is constituted by guilt or shame. In other words, what makes loneliness distinctive currently may itself be guilt or shame. And so I agree with what you're saying, that some policies, by making people telling people off, as it were, for being lonely, it actually exacerbates loneliness.
Yeah.
But both for myself and some of the people I've researched, it is that sense of self-blame for your situation, for your isolation or your rejection, that itself is currently a constitutive part of loneliness. And I didn't hear that in what you were saying. I don't mean you don't say that, but in what you were saying, it was an interesting different angle on guilt and shame as imposed by, I think you're right, imposed by governments and some policies.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to unpack there. Thanks for that reminder again, and another really interesting provocation, Julian. So I'm working on a study at the moment looking at skin picking and the role of shame and loneliness in that. And you are right, shame features highly in the experience of loneliness. And certainly the paper that I wrote last year, where I refer to the clients that I have counselled who bring loneliness into the sessions, shame was a prevailing factor there. They felt ashamed of being lonely. And shame and guilt is the kind of shot through like threads in a carpet, of loneliness. So you're absolutely right. But I think the additional factor when it comes to policy and interventions is, you are lonely, here's things you should be doing about it. And then when people can't do those things, or they feel they have failed in doing those things, there's an additional burden of shame, an additional burden of kind of guilt for not being up to the mark. And I found this a lot with the people with long-term mental illness that I spoke to. They would say, but I try and get out, but the bus service has been cut and I can't get into town to try and make friends, but I should do. I know I should do. Maybe I should walk. Maybe I should try harder. There was so much of this kind of sense of shame that not only were they lonely, but they then felt ashamed because they were not doing what policy and interventions were asking them to do. Which brings us back to the social drivers of loneliness. So, here in the UK, some of you will be familiar with bus services are being cut. So I've got this kind of situation in the rural community where I live, where I know older people used to go in to the village once a week to play bingo and meet their friends. And now they can't do that because the bus service is cut. But a loneliness intervention comes along telling these old people to go out and make friends. And they're saying to me, but I used to do that before and now I can't do that. So there comes the shame. They think they should be doing something, but in fact, it's as simple as the blasted bus service being cut that has stopped behaviours that were very healthy behaviours in the first place. But yes, you're right. The implications of shame and loneliness, yeah, I didn't go into them at all in this paper, but you're right, they are there. And thank you for bringing them to my attention, Julian.
Julian is frozen for a moment, unfortunately, but I hope that he managed to hear your answer, Lydia. And I would like to follow his words, what he has just said, because what is, close to my heart lately in research is the relationship, the connection between unconditional acceptance of other people, so having no requirements, as you just said, that, you know, this policy, government, they had requirements, you should do that, you should do, and so on. So unconditional acceptance and self-acceptance of people. What would you say, Olivia, about the role of these things to prevent people from loneliness or increasing that?
That's a really interesting question. And oh God, my mind is going off in all sorts of directions. Problem of this kind of thinking. So I just got an essay back this morning from one of my students on looking, it's a fantastic essay, and you know, I'm sure she won't mind me telling you about it. It's looking at the loneliness engendered specifically through social media, okay, amongst young people. And I think I'm just going to use this one example in answer to your question. The lack of acceptance of certain types of people on social media is almost at criminal levels. So if you look at what young people are expected to live up to in terms of appearance, activity, numbers of friends, ambition, health, sporting acumen, the pressures on them through social media are so intense that the result is self-loathing, which, you know, your average adolescent will always go through periods of self-loathing. But if you layer on top of that the power of social media, then we have a serious problem in lack of self-acceptance and also lack of acceptance, conditional or otherwise, of other people. So if you look at how intolerant we are in certain discourses around identity politics, how intolerant we are of the other, particularly prevalent on social media, it actually makes me really sad when I hear you say something like unconditional positive regards, that whole Rogerian kind of aspiration. I feel that we've drifted really far from it, and it's absolutely essential that we find a way to get that back.
Yeah, when you were saying about this need to be seen and to see the other person, I was thinking about this unconditional relationship with other people. And what about, because you mentioned the social media, internet, these areas, what about education? I mean, parenting, parents, they have, you know, expectations. Pretty often, these expectations make young people lonely, and you know, they feel that they are not understood by their parents. And my question is, should really education and upbringing be based on these requirements, expectations that we impose to other people, or maybe this foundation could be, you know, something else, which is this unconditional acceptance of another person? What would you say? Because actually pedagogy and education seems to be, you know, created to change other people, let's say. And I find it pretty dangerous, because we should not do that. We could encourage, but I think that you know what I mean. So what about the education and this situation and preventing loneliness in this area of schooling, education, parenting, and so on?
Gosh, that is such a big question. I mean, I have got so many problems with our educational system. It would take me the rest of the week to just list them here, so I'm not even going to start. I mean, sometimes I joke that, you know, our educational system in the UK is tantamount to child abuse, because of the pressures. It's not just
Poland, same in Poland.
Yeah, so there are many countries where you're right, our expectations of children and growing people are not only unreasonable, but they're unfounded. And I think it does create shame, going back to Julian's point. It creates loneliness, it creates isolation, it creates an extreme form of competition.
Yeah.
So I recently gave an interview to a Chinese youth magazine, who have published, China has published one of my books, and there's been a lot of interest amongst young people. And I was talking to the interviewer, and she was telling me how in China, you know, the pressures now in the educational system are so great and so ferocious that children and, you know, teenagers have increasing rates of mental illness, and they have nowhere to go. There's no mental health service or system within the schools or in the local community. So there are groups and groups of teenagers who are increasingly isolated. So I think in answer to your question, the very short answer is we have a massive problem. And when I see children as young as 2 having apps that are connected to their school, which give them points for every activity and every achievement, so that they can compare their points with another 2-year-old, I literally despair. So you are right. We need to find a way back.
Yes.
I don't know how we do that, other than through continuing to reveal the problem. But, you know, this has really become sharpened for me in the past year, because I recently became a grandmother, and I'm looking at my little granddaughter and I'm thinking, oh my God, keep her out of school as long as possible. So I share your frustration. I share it. That's all I can do for the here and now.
Thank you, Olivia. Do we have some other questions or comments? No. Oh, there is one from Maria Di Casca, please.
Just to say thank you, Olivia. Thank you for your
Good
I would
evening.
say lecture. It was really important for us, but thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. And please, anybody who wants to get in touch, just email me. I'm sure Rafa and the team can let you have my email address. Give me your thoughts. Let us know about any collaborations. Let me know about any ideas you have. Really happy to carry on the conversation after today, because these are important subjects: loneliness, isolation, and silence. My favorite thing in the world, silence. So yeah, let's keep the conversation going. Like I say, I'd be delighted to have more talks with you all.
Thank you, Olivia. So maybe to sum up and to slowly go to the end, I would like to quote one thing that you have said, and I've noted that you said that we are linked to others, but bombarded with the message of competitive self-interest. That is a disaster. And maybe the very last question to make us, you know, think what we can change about it. Because it is hard to say. I mentioned this elephant in the living room because that is the atmosphere we all are engaged in, unfortunately. We are all immersed in it. But what could we do about it? What could we do about this? You know, for example, you mentioned school, that people are taught to try to be better than the others, so on, this competitiveness. What could we do about this global political structure problem? What would you say about how to you know, throw out this elephant from the living room?
Yeah, you know, I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent here. One thing that does interest me as a corollary to research into loneliness is how short our attention spans are. So there's a book by Jenny Odell about the attention economy, where she investigates how everything about our life today is grabbing our attention. You know, we're online the whole time, we're algorithms, we are, you know, there's this pull the whole time.
Yeah.
And we have a very short attention span. And nothing has made me more upset in the past year than how short our attention span was regarding the question of the Soviet invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You know, the last time we met online, it was a very new topic and everybody was talking about it, and we all felt there was going to be a groundswell of activity and resistance and help for the Ukraine. And what has happened now is that it's on page 20 in the newspaper. It's in small print. It has dropped off our attention. And that all of that really worries me. It worries me obviously because I have family ties to the Ukraine. It worries me in terms of what that says about us as the West. It worries me about what it says about human beings and our lack of sustained attention to big questions. What we do about that, now there's a good question. I think education has got a role there, because we have to push back against this notion that students and kids want everything in bite-sized chunks. We have to push back against an idea that we can't ask students to do things for a long period of time because they have no attention. We have to actively stretch their attention, and we have to actively stretch our own attention and our own focus. For me, I do that through meditation. That's helpful, but it's not for everybody. I think we all need to find ways of stretching our attention so that we can apply focused attention. And that is why events like this are so important, because we're able to go into these subjects in depth. We're able to apply a sustained attention, and they are godsends, they really are. So let's just carry on trying to stretch our attention and help others stretch our attention, and reminding us of what the big issues are in our society. You know, there are big issues that get splintered and fragmented by all of the small issues, the kind of narcissism of small differences, to use that lovely phrase. So that would be my response. There's no silver bullet, I'm afraid, but that would be my response.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the whole discussion, for your lecture again. And what should we do? I think that we should...
Ilona.
One more question.
Oh, one more question?
Yeah.
Well, I can see.
Ilona.
Okay, do we have some time? Olivia, could we ask one more question?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, that is our marvelous student from the University of Stettin.
Hi,
Ilona.
lovely to see
Please,
you.
Ilona, go ahead.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. It won't be some kind of a question. It will be just my words of gratitude. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was really interesting. And oh, I'm sorry for the noise. And I really wanted to thank you about the mentioning of Ukraine, because I'm Ukrainian myself. I'm from Sumy, and I'll just go away. I'm really touched by it that you have mentioned this topic, because it's really important for me, like for every Ukrainian. And thank you so much for your great support and understanding this. And it means a lot for us. It means the whole world for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Iona, you will know that parts of my talk resonated with what's happening in the Ukraine, because there's an example of how people do find a common language and a common cause and a world in common to work for. And I think that's really interesting. I think the Ukrainians have really given us an example of how we should all be working together towards a better society. So yeah, thank you
so much.
Thank you, Ilona. Once again, thank you, Olivia. I would like to say Slava Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Yeah, God bless Ukraine. And once again, thank you all for attending our seminar. We are happy that you were with us. We are happy that Olivia accepted our invitation, and we had this marvelous time with you. And let me wish us all being more sensitive, more attentive in everyday life, so that people around us were just less lonely. And that's all. Thank you once again.
Thank you for organising today. It's been a real joy. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.